Hello, and welcome to the Fairy Tale Magazine's Author Talks, a series where we bring you conversations with writers, scholars, poets, and artists who use fairy tale and folklore in their work. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jeana Jorgensen, a professor at Butler University and a member of the editorial team of Marvels and Tales, the Journal of Fairy Tale Studies. Jeana's own creative work has been published in literary journals, including Strange Horizons, The Orange and Bee, and Liminality, and she is the author of Folklore 101, Fairy Tale 101, Sex Education 101, and her latest publication is titled The Thorn Key, Fairy Tales in Verse. Jeana, thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy to have you here on Author Talks.
Thanks so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Great. Well, let's start with touching on your academic work, if we can. Your research focuses on gender and sexuality in fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, and it uses disability, feminist, and queer theory. How did you first develop these academic interests, and how do your academic interests influence your creative work?
I was a bookworm as a child, which I'm sure is a surprise to no one. And I remember reading this really thick tome called Folk Tales of the World. And that was one of my first introductions. I also devoured Greek mythology, Norse mythology, basically anything I could get my hands on. And I went to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate degree, and I thought, oh, well, I love writing, I love history. I'd had a number of influential history teachers in high school. My mom was an art teacher, a lot of things. So I was like, oh, I'll get a history degree, I'll be a teacher, and I will write in my off time and kind of make a career of it. And then my first semester at Berkeley, I took a freshman seminar on fairy tales, an intro to cultural anthropology, intro to linguistics, and intro to religious studies. And by the end of that semester, I was like, I want all these things as one thing forever. And it turns out that's kind of what studying folklore is. And then I discovered Alan Dundas was a professor at UC Berkeley, so he became my folklore mentor. And I just dove in deep and never looked back. So I was always really interested in folklore and fairy tales before I even knew these things had names or that there was an academic way to study them. Once I discovered the academic side of things, I was all in because I think one of the best ways that I've heard it explained is that because folklore is informally transmitted traditional culture, to use Lynn McNeil's definition, it's not part of compulsory culture. It's not maintained by institutions, by laws, by the economy. Folklore is opt-in culture. So if people are engaging in some form of folklore, it's because it speaks to their values, it's because they want to, it's because it's fun, a whole lot of reasons, usually more than one reason. And so I realized that by studying folklore, we have our fingers on the pulse of what people actually care about, even if they might not put it in those same words, even if they might not think of it in the same way. So for me, studying folklore and fairy tales is a way to tap into people's actual values, which I find to be very interesting and complex and convoluted, especially around gender and sexuality. People are weird about gender. And so by tuning into the conversations people have about gender in their storytelling, I like to think we can get additional insights that aren't available elsewhere.
That's fabulous. And I love how you segue between the academic and then the creative aspects of folklore and fairy tale. It's wonderful. In your poetry collection, The Thorn Key, which I really do love, you have a poem titled Walking on Knives, which is narrated by a mermaid turned professor who has struck a deal with a sea witch to provide her with information about the world above the waves. And at one point in the poem, the mermaid professor says this: the university gives me first years. I actually talk to my students instead of singing spellbinding lectures that leave them too awed to ask questions. Now, I know the poem is not autobiographical and it goes on to address many sociological and psychological and even ecological issues, but that particular passage really resonated with me as someone who teaches first year college students and as someone who has read and worked with your Folklore 101 and Fairy Tale 101 in my classes. stories. They're both billed as accessible and approachable introductions to the genre. So, how did you develop the voice that you use in those books, which is quite unique? And is it difficult for you to oscillate between that voice and your academic voice and your creative voice across your works?
Yeah, so Folklore 101 started as a series of blog posts, actually. I was disenchanted with academia for reasons. It's an on again, off again love affair for the bulk of my adult life. And I was blogging for Pathos at the time, and I was just like, hey, there's the Folklore Thursday hashtag. I'm going to write a blog post every Thursday about some aspect of folklore. And I did that for years. And so initially, they were just blog posts, they were just for fun, they were just to put what I learned in the ivory tower out in the public sphere for everyone to learn because I'm a big believer in open access, open access publishing. Education should be for everyone, all of these things. And so they kind of just stayed in the blogosphere. And in 2021, I was again kind of in a slump. And a writer friend suggested, "Hey, just write something, just publish a book, just put something out there and see how it goes." And I've published multiple academic articles, which don't pay anything and live behind a paywall, and lots of feelings about academic publishing. And I was like, "Yeah, I'll do that." And I figured I could get an agent, but that would take a long time. And I just wanted to put something out there and see how it went. And so I collected all of those blog posts. I wrote a few new chapters. I wrote an introduction to frame the whole thing. I hired a copy editor, cover designer, indexer, all the things to make this a really nice professional product. And so I published Folklore 101 in October of 2021. So the tone was from the start, because of its blog post origins, very much meant to be accessible for everyone. If I used jargon, I always defined it. And I think my blogging voice has a bit of a snarky, irreverent tone at times because, again, I don't think that academic learning should be mutually exclusive with being like funny or wry or ironic or like having some personality show through. So, because in my academic writing, I don't feel like a lot of my personality can show through. I think that for my more public facing writing, it's fun and cathartic for me to be like, I'm a person, I have a voice, I have a life. Um, so I do have this very informal tone in my nonfiction works. And sometimes it's hit or miss. I know some people read it and they just like blast through it. They're like, that was a fun read. Cool. I learned some stuff. Other people are like, I thought this would be more of a serious book. And I'm like, there's a million of those. Go read something in the library that already exists. If you want a serious book, I'm bringing a new take to it. So I enjoy it. It's fun for me, and I think it's fun for a lot of people.
Yeah. You also beautifully blend different types of voices and different ideas in the Thorn Key in your poetry, where you put old narratives into conversation with popular culture, which I also love. One of your poems begins, "Before there was ghosting, there were selkies." And another poem begins with the line, "Okay, Google, how do I cast a love spell?" Right? So, how does this interaction in your poetry between the old and the new help you to mine folklore and fairy tale for unique messages for your audience?
Think I'm inspired by the work of many authors who have come before me. So Angela Carter in The Bloody Chamber has updated a lot of Charles Perrault's and others' fairy tales to have a slightly more modern, so not very modern, but slightly more modern. So that was one inspiration for me. um Francesca Leah Block's work on fairy tales. I love her work so much. And so she sets a lot of her pieces in contemporary Los Angeles, and someone who grew up in LA, that really resonated with me. So I guess I've been exposed to this idea for decades now that we can and maybe should update fairy tales to have a more contemporary setting and to see how some of the older ideas from certain folk narratives might interact with newer values, newer contexts, and so on, which again, like is a thing that folklore always already does. You know, folklore is constantly being updated to reflect people's changing contexts and circumstances and values and so on. Folklore is kind of the ultimate shapeshifter in that way. So in that sense, I'm not really doing anything new. I just happen to be doing it right now, and we have a lot more cultural references to pack in. So yeah, it's something that I find enjoyable. I like to ask myself, what if a fairy tale character was in a specific time and place that maybe the story we're most familiar with is not set in that specific time and place? How would they respond? How would modern inventions like the internet or birth control or things like that impact their stories and how things played out. So for me, it's a really engaging game of what if that again has a lot of historical precedent.
Fabulous. The Thorn Key as a whole is divided into a series of doors, and you sort of invite readers through the threshold of each door as they make their way through the text. So there's the door of red and white roses, the door of swan and raven feathers, the door of gold and silver crowns, and then the door of bone and ice needles. Tell us a little bit about the structure you use to organize your poetry and how it relates to the title of the collection, especially when you admonish your readers to be careful of the thorn key because it bites.
I knew I wanted some kind of organization for the book because I didn't want to just throw 40-ish poems at the reader and be like, good luck. So I was in conversation with my fairy tale colleagues at a conference that I came up with this idea of structures, parts, things. And at first it was going to be maybe the seasons or something like that. And then I was having a bad night one time and I was like, I wrote down all the titles of all my poems so far on post-it notes and I tore them all into pieces. And then I put them all on my dining room table. I just started like shuffling them around and looking at kind of what came of it. And I sort of clustered them by these emerging themes. And they weren't really clear cut and they weren't really what I expected, but they kind of emerged so that the door of oh I have to look it up. Um, the door of red and white roses, those poems are all about relationships, mostly romantic relationships. Some happy, some not. Which is also maybe just a little autobiographical. The Door of Swan and Raven Feathers, that one is about found family. And so I used that title in particular to refer to Arne Thompson Uther Tale type 451, the brothers who are turned into birds, or the maiden who seeks her brothers, because sometimes they're turned into swans and sometimes they're turned into ravens. So I wanted to kind of allude to that. The Door of Gold and Silver Crowns, that one, those ended up being about fate or about destiny, even though the topics of the poems are all very different. But I felt they were united by this sense of the protagonist is like pulled or drawn towards something that's maybe out of their control, maybe within their control. And what do they do about that? And then the Door of Bone and Ice Needles, I refer to this one as like really dark stuff. So most of my retellings of Tale Type 510B, The Dress of Gold, Silver Stars, Donkey Skin, most of them are clustered in there because that is a pretty grim tale type, the father-daughter incest one. And so I had these doors kind of in my mind, and again in conversation with some of my colleagues, like the idea of like a key type title came about, and so I thought of it being a thorn key because I wanted the thorns to be a symbol for something that can at once harm you, but also have a protective function. And so the idea is that the reader is using this key that's maybe like pricking into your hand where you're trying to use it to like unlock different doors and learn about different aspects of human experience. That's kind of what was in my mind while I was coming up with all of this, but I would, of course, be curious to hear what others think of it.
Works beautifully as an organization structure. I absolutely loved it and was so excited each time I got to a new door and wondered what I would find behind it. As you mentioned in your last answer, do have quite a few poems in your collection which retell either ATU 510B, that shadow tale of Cinderella, or ATU 451, the maiden who seeks her brothers. Why have you been so drawn to work with these particular tale types? Are they your favorite fairy tales? Or if they're not, have you had the chance to explore your favorite fairy tale in any of your creative works?
Yeah, so I never know what to answer when somebody asks me what my favorite fairy tale is. I suspect we all have this problem. Like once you've read bunches and bunches, like, well, this one's cool because this, and that one's cool because that. Um, but I would say 510B is one of my favorites. It's one that I spent a lot of time both in undergraduate papers and in my master's thesis working on. And I think it's like there's really no correspondence between that story and my actual life. I think I'm fascinated by it because in patriarchal society, the relationship in a family unit between the father and the daughter is the most asymmetrical in terms of power. And I think to me that just kind of encapsulates in a nutshell so much of what is weird about our sex gender system in so many Western cultures. And so I find that really fascinating. And I've also been really interested in how scholars have interpreted that tale. And that's what my master's thesis, which is now an article, is about. Um, how so many scholars, including my mentor, Alan Dundas, would they'd look at the story and they'd be like, let's apply some Freudian stuff, electrocomplex, the girl wanted it, all these things. And I was sitting there in class like, no, I don't agree with that. I think this is a feminist tale about surviving abuse in the family of origin and running away and spending some time under the cinders or whatever metaphor you want to have for like a shame reaction to being abused, and then emerging stronger and better and more resilient. So that tension, and not just in the story itself, but in how people interpret and respond to the story, has always really captured my imagination. So that's one that I enjoy kind of like playing with and poking at. And I think all of my poems highlight really different aspects of the story too. Like there's so many ways it can be interpreted that I think just trying to pin it down with only one interpretation is maybe a little underwhelming. And as far as tail type 451, again, not my life experience. Like I have one sibling, I have a sister, like there's no brothers. But I think that one's really interesting. And I've written a couple of different book chapters about this, or articles, where I think that the girl who is bound to silence to protect her family of origin also fails at being a good wife and mother. And so I feel like this story contains a symbolic refusal to do it all and be it all, which I think a lot of feminine type socialization tells us we have to do it all and be it all and be a perfect wife and mother and all the things. And this girl's like, yeah, no, I just can't. Sorry, they're gonna take my babies. I can't. So I just find that one a really interesting story in terms of its gender dynamics as well.
Yeah, you really rewrite those tales in very innovative ways. So it gives your reader a lot to think about, which I think is fabulous. Finally, the Thorn Key also features a poem, and it's one of my favorites in the collection, titled What Happened to the 12th Dancing Princess, circa 1946. So this situates the 12 dancing princesses in a patriarchal, sort of post World War II society. Obviously, again, not autobiographical, but I just want to use it to segue into your love of dancing. I always find it fascinating when people are talented in and passionate about more than one creative area in life. So tell us a little bit about your background with dance and how your participation in this art form is similar to or different from the other work that you do.
I did not think I would be a dancer. I was a tomboy growing up, and my parents put me in some summer week dance class that I absolutely hated when I was 8 years old. I was like, I'm never going to dance again. Um, but as I kind of transitioned into being a teenager and puberty and all those things, I found that running around, playing soccer, kicking the boys in the shins, climbing trees, and so on, like my body was changing and suddenly I had hips and I didn't like it. So because I lived in Los Angeles and it's a very, diverse multicultural city, I had been exposed to belly dancing or Middle Eastern dance. And, it's at the Moroccan restaurant, it's at the Greek festival, it's at the Ren Fair. And so on a whim, shortly before I turned 16, I signed up for a belly dancing class at a local community college. And I just totally fell in love. It was like, it was fun, it was expressive. I love learning about Middle Eastern music and culture, and having hips was a good thing. So I stuck with it through undergrad, found some great dancers in the Bay Area to study with, stuck with it in grad school. And by the time I was in grad school, too, I was like, I really enjoy the life of the mind, but I also have a body and I like probably should neglect that while I'm like in the archives and in the library and blah blah blah. So for me, dance became a form of self-care. It became a form of community. I'm really close friends with a lot of people I've danced with in the past and with my current troupe here in Indianapolis. And so it's both something that I do to nourish my physical self and my creative self, something I do to stay connected to friends I have really all over the world at this point. So I'd say it's gone beyond hobby to like a really significant part of my life. And I don't know that I see a lot of obvious parallels between how I approach dance and how I approach writing. I definitely like some structure, like the main dance style I study, teach, and perform, which is called Fat Chance Belly Dance Style. It definitely has structure because it prioritizes group improvisation rather than learning choreographies. So I'm not good at memorizing things. I think that's a pretty constant thread through my life. But give me some structure, give me some tools, and like I'm in. I am unafraid to improvise and just try new things and stuff like that. So I would say that's probably a common thread. And yeah, just the ability to express yourself for something that you're going through, maybe to cathartically work through something. I know I've had some dances that I look back at that performance and I was like, yeah, I was working through that breakup, or yeah, I was working through that whatever. So I definitely do that in my dance as well as in my writing. But yeah, I enjoy having creative outlets. I think that most humans are creative people on some level or another. Like even if you don't think you're creative or you don't think you're good at art, like there are so many ways to be creative and to engage with the arts and things like that. I truly think there's something for everyone.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it occurred to me as you were speaking that I almost think fairy tales themselves are in some way narratives of both the body and the mind. So it's an interesting connection that you made. I'll have to think about that for quite a while as I process that idea of using dance as an art form akin to other art forms as well. Well, I have long been a fan of both your scholarly and your creative work. So thank you so much for joining us today on Author Talks. This has been a lovely time for me. You can learn more about Jeana Jorgensen on her website, and you can pick up a copy of The Thorn Key, Fairy Tales in Verse, wherever books are sold. We highly recommend it here at the Fairy Tale Magazine. So once again, for all of us at the Fairy Tale Magazine, I'm Kelly Jarvis. Thanks for joining us.